Hello and welcome. I'd first like to thank the library for having me do this program. But just as important, all of you who are brave enough to show up to talk about the bizarre creatures of the Midwest from the safety of wherever you're watching this show. So with that in mind, let's explore. My name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program, and although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires over in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of abductions, really odd people, strange places, you name it. If it's just a little offbeat and bizarre, I've traveled around the globe in search of these anomalies. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore for this program. Some of the weirdest creatures that the Midwest has to offer. For the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour of the entire Midwest on some of the most bizarre creatures out there. Now, I'm going to give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of our research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to travel to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe these legends are real. So with that, let's journey to some of the most unknown creatures in the Midwest. First stop, right down the road from you, one of my favorite stories. It's that of the Van Meter Visitor. The 5 nights of terror that happened in Van Meter, a small town about 20 minutes southwest of Des Moines. That's when, in late September of 1903, the newspapers were calling the visitation a reign of terror, a monster of awful form. This huge, gigantic beast. It all began when an implement dealer was coming home late at night, about 1 p.m., when he saw what appeared to be a bright, shining light on one of the buildings. He slowed down thinking it might be an intruder or a bank robber, only to see that light disappear and then reappear on the other side of the street on top of one of those buildings in a matter of a couple seconds. Some say it actually flew to the other side. Well, the next day he started talking about his sighting. No one paid it much mind. That is until the following evening, Dr. Alcott was sleeping above his office when he was awoken in the middle of the night by a bright light flashing into his room. He went over to the window to see what was causing the light. And when he looked down onto the main drag of Van Meter, he saw this creature standing or lurking there. Said it was about 8 feet tall, had giant leather bat-like wings, had a horn on his head, and it was projecting that light that had awoken him. I have to give Dr. Alcott credit. He didn't just watch this thing. He grabbed his gun, went out and blasted it 5 times, kept the last shot in case he needed it, and barricaded himself in for the safety of the next morning. The next day, the town was split. Half the people thought it might be a monster. The other half thought it was still a bank robber or an intruder. One of those who did not believe in the creature was the bank manager, Clarence Dunn. So he grabbed his shotgun filled with buckshot, headed down to the town's bank and protected the money from the intruders. That is until about 1 a.m., he too noticed a bright light flashing in the bank. Behind it, he could see what appeared to be some giant bird-like creature, an immense size. He actually was so terrified he blasted out the front window of the bank, shooting at the monster. The next morning, when safety arrived, He went out to see if he could find the carcass, at least some blood, feathers, fur, something, but he found nothing except 3 giant 3-toed prints in the mud similar to this. He took a cast of one of the prints, but we don't know what happened to it. Maybe it's been lost to history, maybe it's in your attic or your basement right now. Now Van Meter was split. For 2 more nights, people were wondering what was going on. People saw it again, blasted at it. Finally, on the 5th night, they could take no more. They believed the thing was coming from the old abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town, right next to this brick and tile factory here. So a posse of men gathered together with all their weapons and they waited. Just before it got dark, the creature popped out. This time it had another one with it, a smaller version, perhaps the female gender or the offspring. It flew off. Just before daybreak, it came back. The newspaper said that the posse shot at it so many times they could have sunk the Spanish fleet. But either they were the worst shots in Iowa, or this thing was impervious to their weapons because it had no effect. It simply descended back to the abandoned coal mine, and like a great Hollywood cliffhanger, this is where the story ended. No one knows what happened. Did they kill it? Is it still there? Did it fly off to become the Mothman of Point Pleasant? We don't know. In fact, no one even knows how they covered up the old abandoned coal mine. You can see here I'm standing over the top of where the entrance was, and you wouldn't even know there was a huge mining operation there. Over the years, people forgot the story, except for the fact that kids, often teenagers, would go out to the remnant buildings of the brick and tile factory and see shadowy things moving and lurking about. They had forgotten the visitor story, so they blamed it on hauntings and ghosts. My favorite part of this story is that every year the people of Van Meter put together a Van Meter Visitor Festival where you can go and see the buildings where they shot at this monster and walk out to the old abandoned coal mine and see if the monster's still there. The bad news is the conference isn't until September of this year. The good news is that gives you plenty of time to get your weapons in order to capture this monster. As you saw in my introduction, I did spend some time over in Romania, in Transylvania, looking for legends and lore of vampires. But little did I know I should have stayed right here in the Midwest. Starting in Wisconsin. Back in the 1980s, the town of Mineral Point, Wisconsin was overrun with vampires, or at least sightings of them. It all began when this police officer, John Pepper, was patrolling late at night when he passed by this cemetery, the Graceland Cemetery. That's when he saw a very tall, very pale, very thin, very ugly vampire, complete with a cape. Officer Pepper gave chase to this vampire, chased it to the side of a cemetery where it easily flew over the fence and disappeared into the night. Officer Pepper did not want to report this. He knew how he sounded, but he was on duty. He had to make the report. And as you can imagine, the very next day, media from all over the world descended upon Mineral Point looking for the Mineral Point vampire. It got to be so much, Officer Pepper quit the police force, moved away, and refused to talk about the case. I've tried contacting him numerous times. He has never replied to any of my contacts. Once his story came out, people claimed vampires were jumping out of every dark corner of Mineral Point. Even to this day, people believe vampires are still in Mineral Point and the Graceland Cemetery. I've been to the cemetery both day and night many times. I've never been attacked by the vampire, but then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me. This next case may be a vampire or a death siren. It happened in the small town of Winona, Minnesota in 1922, and it talks about the case of Frances Block, a young woman who passed away. And as soon as she died, she was buried out at St. Mary's Cemetery on the edge of the town. And after she died, many of her brothers started dying as well. It came to a point that the father, who was living on the east end of Winona in this home in a very superstitious neighborhood, started listening to his neighbors who told him that the cause of all of his family's death was the daughter. You see, the belief back then was the first child to die in a family would act like a death siren or some type of paranormal beacon, trying to entice their siblings to join them in death, like some vampire or siren. In fact, the only way to stop this was to go out to the grave, dig up the person, chop their head off, and bury it by their feet so they couldn't rise up and entice their siblings to join them. So that's what he did. He went out to the cemetery, dug up his daughter's grave, was going to chop off her head, but then he got cold feet. He chickened out. Instead, he put a cross on her chin and reburied her. Well, of course, the police found out about this, and they went out to make sure he did not desecrate the body. And in fact, when they dug up the body, they found that he didn't cut off her head or that of her brother, who he also dug up the body. The best part of this story is that they did not charge him with any crime. Apparently, because he had not harmed the bodies, there was no crime. In the 1920s, you could dig up a body in Winona. As long as you didn't harm it, you could put it right back. Great case of maybe a death siren or a vampire. Here I am over at Loch Ness on one of my expeditions looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one over here in the blue coat without the really cool beard. Little did I know, I should have stayed here in the Midwest. Well, the Mississippi River, that is. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River. Parents did not want their children playing down there because newspapers kept saying there was a giant monster living in the river, all the way down south to the end of the river, all the way up to northern Minnesota to the start of the river. They claimed that this thing was 10 feet long, 250 pounds, and covered in this thick, scale-like armor that a bullet would not even pierce. Then parents really got terrified because what happened was they were finding a lot of men were drowning in the Mississippi River. But when they pulled them out, they found deep scratch marks or gashes on their calves and ankles as though something grabbed them and pulled them out and drowned them. This led to news stories that there are man-eating fish in the Mississippi River. Do not go down there, whatever you do. But then the newspaper said, don't worry, we found the answer. We've solved this case. It's okay, you can go back. It's nothing more than a couple alligator gar swimming around. Which is all well and good when you don't know what an alligator gar looks like. But when you see that this is an alligator gar, it's a little bit different. Because if a 10-foot garfish swims against you, you're going to think it's a monster. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. But if you follow the Mississippi River up a bit, you'll eventually come to Lake Pepin, a lake on the river dividing Wisconsin and Minnesota. They believe something bigger and more sinister and more deadly is lurking than just an alligator gar. The first tales go back to the native peoples that were said to only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out on the water because every time they capsized or drowned, it was blamed on this giant deadly beast. When the steamboats came up the Mississippi, the captains reported seeing the same giant leviathan of the deep. When the white pioneers finally settled the area permanently, they started writing about the cases in their newspapers. Here's one from 1871 talking about the creature being somewhere between the size of a rhinoceros and an elephant, which could move through the water with great rapidity. We have newspaper accounts dating back to the Civil War about a beast being in the water. Over the years, not only have people believed they've seen it, some believe they've captured photographic evidence of it, including this photograph that was snapped that seemingly shows a long neck and a 20 to 30 partially submerged body that the witness could barely see. A few years back, a man was out fishing with his buddy. They were watching the water and they noticed what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. They thought it was odd, so they motored their boat over there, only to discover it wasn't a log. They snapped this photograph of what they thought was a long-necked, humped-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. They watched it for a bit and then it descended out of sight. I've been to Lake Pepin on numerous expeditions, most recently living on a houseboat for many days and nights with noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had fishing equipment, we had bait, we had nets, we even jumped in using ourselves as bait, but unfortunately, or maybe luckily for us, Pepe, the lake monster, did not make an appearance. But the people of Lake City, Minnesota are so convinced that Pepe is real, or at least convinced you'll come looking for it, they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. But you don't have to leave Iowa to see monsters. In fact, for the relatively small amount of lakes you have a lot of sea serpent stories, from the Des Moines River to Lake Okoboji to Spirit Lake, Skunk River, the Raccoon River. All kinds of sea serpent reports in Iowa as well. But if you'd rather not dip your toes into the water, you may go scouting out for perhaps the most infamous creature in cryptozoology, and that is the Bigfoot. Known throughout the world as the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the Abominable Snowman. Most people, when they think of these creatures, think of the heavily forested western states of the U.S. They don't often think of the Midwest. But in fact, we have some of the weirdest accounts of these creatures here in the Midwest. If you head down to southern Illinois by Murfreesboro in a place called Little Egypt, you'll come to the Big Muddy River, which got its name because it's a big, muddy river. It received international fame back in 1973 when two young lovebirds were down at Riverside Park enjoying the evening together. That's when all of a sudden a horrible stench came into their car and they heard a bizarre growl or howl and then noticed this giant creature emerging from the river coming toward their car. They said it was at least 7 feet tall, had very light whitish gray fur covering it, and it was covered from the waist down in this thick matted down mud coming from the river. They were terrified of this monster. They immediately drove down, even though it was late at night, to the law enforcement agency. Several officers showed up, scouring the area for this thing, whatever it was. While they were there, they could still smell the terrible smell in the area. They also saw several indentations they thought were footprints in the thick mud. That's when one of the officers heard a growl in the woods, dropped his revolver and left the woods, would not go back for it. Several hours later, he garnered the courage to go back in. That story was never reported to the public because it looked so bad. It wasn't until we interviewed several of the officers that were there that night that told us the story about the dropped gun. But the stories of Murfreesboro and the Mud Monster go back many, many years. Here's a story from 1949, a newspaper article offering a $100 reward for anyone who could trap the strange-looking monster out in Murfreesboro. 1998, Bob Raymond owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town. And he was having trouble with teenagers coming in and ripping out the tape decks of the cars or the CD players. And so he hired a security guard. But they had the plan that if any intruders came in, they would both go out there together to confront the trespassers. And Bob told me that one night, the security guard saw something big moving at the back of the junkyard. So he called Bob, and together they went out there. As they were walking back, they could see something big in the shadows moving. And then they caught a glimpse of the eyes, glowing red eyes staring at them, and a horrible smell. They were staring at some huge monster shuffling back and forth between the cars, mumbling to itself in some unknown, unintelligible language of some sort. The security guard had a gun and he pulled it out and he said, "Bob, should I shoot this thing?" Bob told me that he smartly said, "No, we don't know what this thing's capable of. Shooting it might just make it angry." So they walked back, tried to lure the thing under their motion lights of their garage, but the thing would not bite on their trick. But it did seem to follow them back to the shed. They locked themselves in the shed, terrified, when all of a sudden they started hearing banging on the door. And then it got much louder, a thunderous bang. Bob told me he believed the thing was throwing boulders at the door, but not trying to break in, because Bob thought it could have easily done that. But more sinister, this goal seemed to be to terrify the witnesses. Finally, after calming down, Bob and the security guard tore out of there. Next day, they found giant footprints around the area where that creature was spotted. But you don't have to believe Bob. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go there on your own and check the river out for yourself. Just probably don't go swimming in the river. You'll probably come out looking like a mud monster. Or you can just check out my book on the subject and save yourself perhaps an attack of the monster. In Iowa, you have your own mud monster over in Metz, on Metz Bridge. The story is, many years ago, a man was driving home drunk from one of the bars, and the intoxicated man lost control of his vehicle, drove over the bridge, and drowned in the water down below. Now the legend is, if you go to the bridge, you might encounter the phantom car or vehicle of that driver. Many people see the headlights coming toward them, either in front or behind, only to have them vanish right before their eyes. But my favorite story in Metz Bridge is the mud monster. Just like the Murfreesboro mud monster, the Big Muddy, this thing seems to be a Bigfoot-looking creature caked in mud. As you can see, with the evidence of all the graffiti, lots of kids go out to this bridge. Oftentimes, they believe they've encountered the monster. One guy told me he actually saw it decades ago walking on top of the water. Not in the water, walking on top of it. That was enough to take him and make him not want to ever visit the place again. But this next creature I'm going to tell you about is one you might not want to know about. It's certainly one you don't want to say its name, because many cultures believe that this next creature can do you harm. And of course, that creature is the Wendigo, the winter monster of the north. It began as a First Nation spirit or creature or legend up in the north woods of Canada. And this creature, which was gigantic proportions, in northern Minnesota, they thought the Wendigo was a harbinger of death, a death omen, that if you saw it, much like seeing or hearing the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. The creature was always reported to be very skeletal looking, tall, very thin. Sometimes it's missing its own mouth and lips as it's consumed them in its never-ending hunt for human flesh. Many believe it could possess you and turn you into a Wendigo as well, or just outright kill you and consume you, again in its insatiable hunger for human flesh. One of my favorite places that has a legend in the Midwest of the Wendigo is just east of Bemidji, Minnesota, in a place aptly named Lake Wendigo. It's a lake on an island on a lake, which makes it an anomaly in its own right, featured here in Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon as the lake within a lake. There have been many stories about the haunted lake itself. Several books have been written about it. One of my favorite tales tells of a group of people going out to the island. And when the women started setting up base camp and cooking, the men went into the woods to hunt for game. When they didn't return that night, the women got scared. The next morning, they went looking for them, only to find them strung up and skinned, hanging from the trees. They left the island, vowing never to return, saying it was cursed, it was bad medicine. When help arrived to look for the bodies, they were never found, and to this day, nobody has ever found the bodies of those missing men. There are other tales of people finding giant holes in the ice of Lake Wendigo with huge footprints coming out, as though the Wendigo came out of the water, walked to the island to search for its next kill or its prey. Back in the winter of 2015, I set off on an expedition with two of my colleagues to Lake Wendigo. Left with Kevin Nelson here, as you can see with the hat and beard, and Noah Voss on the other side. You can't tell, but that's me there in the middle. The reason you can't tell is it's about 30 degrees below zero with the wind whipping through the wind chill. So for several hours we had to walk across the lake hauling our gear by sleigh. Let me give you a quick glimpse of what that was like. So you can see we're tethered together here in case one of us fell through, the other two could pull them out. We finally made it to the lake. Many believe the lake itself is the Wendigo. While we got there, my colleague Noah here, Noah and I, there he is, decided we were going to spend the expedition in our tent. But my colleague Kevin over here, he wanted more of an adventure. So he was going to spend the expedition in his hammock outside in 30 degree below zero weather. First thing we had to do is get our fire going. Not only for heat, warmth, and light, but we also had to keep our tallow hot. Tallow is an animal fat. And many believe that you can kill the Wendigo with hot tallow. That you can pour the hot tallow down his throat, it will melt its icy heart, and it will die. Just how you're supposed to pour it down his throat, I'll leave it up to you. But we had our tallow hot the entire expedition. And then we made our way to the lake. As I mentioned, many believe the lake is the Wendigo, that that's where it lives. And in fact, there have been many drownings in the lake. Parents do not like their children swimming in the lake because so many children have drowned. The legend is if you walk around the lake, the Wendigo will snatch you in and pull you in and drown you. So one night when we had a great base campfire going, Noah and I decided to go try to conjure up the Wendigo in the middle of the lake. We were filming at this time, and while we were filming, we paused a moment where Noah said, "My boots are crunching the snow too loud. Nobody's going to hear what we're talking about." So we paused, and while we paused, something caught our attention and startled us. Let's take a look.
Trying to be quiet. What is it? Okay.
All right, let's take another look here.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for. What is it? Okay.
Now, most likely it was a big bird of prey or an owl or something. I can tell you we didn't see anything, but owls are notoriously associated with the Wendigo. Some say they act as spies for the Wendigo, where others claim the Wendigo can shapeshift, and it often takes the form of an owl to spy on people before it attacks them. But even though we didn't see the owl or the big bird of prey or whatever startled us, it got our adrenaline going for the expedition, so much that Kevin spent the night with his axe right next to his hammock just in case the Wendigo showed up. If you do venture out there, I recommend doing so in the summer. You'll have a much more pleasant experience, or simply read about it in the safety of your favorite reading chair. If you'd rather not look for the deadly Wendigo, I recommend you head right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, to a place called Mary Dean, an entire island that was inhabited and named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean who drowned while coming up on a boat. It was said she was buried in an unmarked grave out on the island. At one time, an entire town lived on the island. They had a post office and several businesses. But now it's completely abandoned, but not empty. Many believe the spirit of that young Mary Dean still haunts the area. But my favorite part of this legend is there's a dare associated with it. A lot of these paranormal places have dares attached to them. What is the dare of Mary Dean? Well, let's take a look. I'm here at the boat landing of Mary Dean, where the dare is that if you're foolish enough to go into the water, the vengeful spirit of Mary Dean will try to pull you under, and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. So I'm going to take this dare right now. No life jacket, no swimming apparel, just me versus Mary Dean. So let's see how this goes. I know you're all wondering if I survived this or not, but the water gets deep and then shallow and then deep again. My favorite part is that you can camp out on the island like I did. You don't need to register, you don't need to pay, you can simply camp. Many people that see the spirit of this woman out there claim that she'll act like a siren, trying to entice you in by saying things like, "Help me, I can't swim. Save me, I'm drowning, please help." And in fact, every year, several people do drown in this spot. Their friends and family often report that the person seemed to be called there for some apparent reason, and then they lost their lives and met their watery grave there. Very creepy spot that many people don't like visiting. So I'm out here in the middle of the river, waiting for Mary Dean to pull me under. So I wait for quite a while, and then I make my way back here. Well, thankfully, the spirit of Mary Dean did not pull me under into those dark, churning, cold waters of the river. So another dare completed. So if you like dares like that, go to my website. You can see me do dozens and dozens from around the country, rather than you risking your own life. But the story gets even better, because the story is that when the island was inhabited, a doctor had several dogs, and those dogs mauled some children and had to be put to death. Now the legend is that when you go out to the boat landing by the island, you will see what many people are calling the Hellhounds of Mary Dean. If you've never heard of Hellhounds, they're large black dogs with glowing red eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many believe that they do the devil's bidding, that they guard portals to hell. But just to show you we're not the only weird people to believe in these hellhounds, a few years back I was over in Central America, over in the jungles there, searching for a jungle protector that they called the Tata Duende. And everywhere I went looking for this diminutive, backward-footed creature, villagers said, "You better get back here before nightfall, because if you're not back before the sun goes down, you might encounter our hellhounds." They called them cadeos. And they believed that these things had supernatural powers, that if they saw you, they would connect with you and slowly steal your energy. And unless you could find a powerful shaman or a bush doctor to remove the curse, you'd be dead within a week of seeing these monsters. So being the researchers that we were, we made it a point to stay out past dark every night. And knock on wood, I'm still here today. But back to the boat landing of Mary Dean. After one of my programs, a big burly biker guy came up to me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything. He told me him and his buddies were taking their motorcycles out to see Mary Dean. They had never heard the Hellhound legend, But as soon as they got there, he said they were surrounded by 3 hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds, he told me 3 things stood out to him. 1, they had glowing red eyes. 2, they were nearly transparent. He could almost see right through them. And 3, no matter how fast they went on their motorcycles, these things kept up with them. It wasn't until he went to kick one and his big biker boot went right through it that they finally disappeared. I'll leave it up to you to head there and discover these hellhounds for yourself. But if hellhounds are too spooky for you, maybe you want to start off with something that might not at first glance seem too scary. Of course, I'm referring to the little people, the hidden folk, the good folks, the gnomes, fairies, goblins, you name it, these little things out of folklore. One of my favorite places to experience legends of these things is in Pipestone, Minnesota, at the National Monument, a sacred area because this is where Native people quarry to get the stone that they use in their ceremonial pipes. So when I first went there, I was staying at the haunted Calumet Inn, a hotel in downtown Pipestone, thought to be haunted by a former lady of the night and a man who lost his life in the fire. But everywhere we went, villagers said, get out to the monument because they believed it was haunted. They told me that while walking along the trails, you could often see and hear the ghostly image of what appeared to be a native man dressed in full native regalia. Thinking maybe he was doing a ceremony or paying his respects, they would follow him only to have him vanish right before their eyes. But they also believed something else was out at the National Monument, and that was the little people. Again, 3 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap, right out of folklore. When I was over in Ireland, I'd walk into a pub and say, where do all the gnomes and fairies hang out? And they'd say, which ones? Try doing that here, you'll probably get thrown out of the pub thinking you're intoxicated. But over there, they believed these things had supernatural powers, that they could take your sight, your hearing, or even lull you into their world where you'd be fairy-led and never come back. So they believed that when you went looking for these creatures, that it was imperative that you bring an offering with you, whether it was some tobacco, a shiny rock, some candy, something to appease the little people. So when I was staying at the Calumet Inn, I walked out, it's about a mile away, to the location of the sacred monument. I found a spot where I said, if little people exist, this looks like a perfect location for them to hang out. So I got under a tree, I sat down, I put out my bait, my offering, and I called out for the little people to make themselves known. Nothing happened, but 15 minutes later, something dropped out of the tree into my hair, or at least I think it did. I couldn't find anything, but I swore something, an acorn or a twig, fell into my hair. 15 minutes later, the same thing happened, but nothing was there. Then, even though I had just walked there, it was a beautiful sunny afternoon, I suddenly felt very drowsy, like I was going to fall asleep. Maybe I was being fairy-led into their realm. So I shot up, walked back to the visitor center. There I started talking to some of the stone carvers that worked there, carving their stone as cultural ambassadors. One lady who had been there 20 years, her mother almost double that, told me that they often would see the little people rattling and hear them rattling pipes in the back locked room, and when they'd go back, they'd see them scatter. She also told me that when her and her mother would be working, it would feel like a fly would land in their hair. They thought it was the little people tugging at their hair in a playful, trickster-like manner. Maybe the same thing that happened to me. But as I was leaving, she told me, whatever you do, do not call out for the little people because they'll make themselves known. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just calling out for them, but luckily I'm still here today. But gnomes and little people are one thing. What about giant werewolf-looking creatures? Well, thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, the southeastern portion of the state. when people would be driving down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, mostly at night, but not always, people would be driving down the road when all of a sudden, for a lack of a better term, they reported seeing a werewolf-type creature. Bigger than a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with that long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur. Since Linda's books came out, people all over the country have contacted me about seeing these things, often on the side of the road eating roadkill or freshly killed prey. Right outside of Fort Dodge, Iowa, is this bridge called Terra. Small town that's been completely forgotten. But the locals, they don't call this bridge Terra Bridge. They call it Terror Bridge. The reason being is that dating back to the 1800s, there's a story of a man working for the railroad. He was a pile driver, hitting stakes into the ground when one shot up and decapitated him. Many believed his spirit was haunting the bridge. In fact, those strong, big, tough railroad men, many of them refused to go across the bridge at night because every time they did, they either saw the ghostly image of their fallen companion or they saw what appeared to be a ghostly phantom train. They could see the light coming toward them. They could hear the rumbling of the engine. They could feel the vibrations, but nothing ever arrived. I have newspaper accounts going back to the 1800s talking about ghost hunters from Fort Dodge going out there. But folklore is never stagnant. It's always morphing and progressing. And over the years, people have forgotten about the story of the pile driver because a new story has replaced it. And that tells the tale of a woman going out to the bridge with her children. She was very distraught, lost it, snapped, had a mental collapse. So she waited, and she waited. Eventually a train came rumbling by, and one by one she threw her children over onto that oncoming train where they met their end. When they were disposed of, she too jumped over and joined them in death. Now the legend states that when you go out to the bridge, not only will you see the ghostly image of that young murdering mother, but many claim that if you do not lock your doors and windows while on the bridge, she will try to throw you over to your death too. Last time I was there, I was with the researchers Kevin Nelson and Noah Voss. I was down below here under the railroad tracks. They were up above. Not only did they not stay in their car and lock the doors and windows, they came over to the side. They were up above, hoping that the spirit of the woman would try to throw them over. I was down below here filming, praying that she would throw them to their death. But unfortunately for me, and luckily for them, she did not make an appearance. But the story gets even better because dating back to the same 1800s period, all the way up to modern day, people have been driving their horse and buggy and now their vehicles down the back roads of the area when all of a sudden they too spot something that shouldn't be there. Just like Bray Road, they're seeing this large biped moving upright on its hind legs like you and I do. One person told me they saw it keeping up with their car even as they approached 50 miles per hour. What I love about these stories, though, is that outside of charging at a couple vehicles, the creatures seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of them. And rather than attack people, they seem to rather just scurry back into the brush undetected. So the good news is, if you go looking for these creatures, most likely you probably won't die. Well, 50-50. The choice is up to you. But as I'm running low on time today, here's what I hope you take from this program. That these stories happen all over the place, to believers, to skeptics, and everybody in between. A lot of the time they happen when people are just simply driving by when they catch something that they didn't think was real. Something that science says doesn't exist. Skeptics say they can't exist. Yet hundreds of people in the Midwest are coming face to face with these creatures every single year. So keep an eye out, because you never know when you might be the next to experience one of these strange creatures. And with that, if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or possibly need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here after watching the program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of the Midwest, and I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird area. That when you go on your adventure, you're going to see odd things. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. If you don't want your adventure to end, go to my website, chadlewisresearch.com, get any of my books, type in the library code of library, and you get 15% off any of my books. But I do want to again thank the library for having me here for this program. I can't think of a time in our history when the library was more important than it is today. With everything that's going on in politics, society, the pandemic, the library is that treasure that is the fabric that keeps the community together. And they're doing a tremendous job. And again, I can't imagine we ever have needed libraries as much as we do today. So if you liked programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, the library's put a ton of work into getting me here, and they should be applauded, and thank you all for coming.